I will go ahead and introduce Kristi Dosh. Kristi received her bachelor's in politics from Oglethorpe University, and then she got her law degree at University of Florida. So she is a Gator grad. And then she went on to work as a legal secretary for White and Johnson and an associate for Mullins before transitioning into sports business reporting. So she actually has a law degree, but has done a lot of business reporting. Her work in sports business reporting includes Forbes, Comcast Sports Southeast, and ESPN. She's been an adjunct professor at UNF. She's also been a radio host for 1010XL and a director of sport marketing for Reputation Link. She has written a book called Saturday Millionaires, How Winning Football Builds Winning Colleges, and has been a contributing writer for Fast Company and Entrepreneur Media. She's currently the founder and publicist for Guide My Brand, and a writer, a reporter, and a public speaker for Sport Business Enterprises. Is that how I say it? I'm always practicing that one. So she's going to come up and share. We're so excited. So if you guys could give her a round of applause.
The moral of my story is that I write too much, and all those jobs, that's what they have in common is writing, because I love to write. So I have been writing about the business of college sports for close to 12 years now, both for Forbes and for my own site, businessofcollegesports.com. And name, image, and likeness is really interesting to me because when I think back to how we got here, I think that it started about the same time I started writing about the business of college sports. Not because of me, but our timelines really align because that's when a lot of the discussion around how student athletes can and should be compensated really started to heat up. And I'm going to talk really briefly about that and sort of go into where we are now and how it has been playing out so far. So just to kind of get us started with what the rules were around name, image, and likeness prior to this summer is that the NCAA did not allow student athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. That meant they couldn't be compensated for their autograph. They couldn't be compensated for social media posts. When they appeared in video games, which we're going to talk about in a second, they couldn't be compensated for use of their name, image, and likeness in that video game. And part of what the NCAA was trying to protect against was undue influence from boosters and others who might try to funnel money to student athletes through these opportunities to get them to go to a specific school or stay at a specific school or maybe transfer to a specific school. So we can talk a little bit about how that has started playing out. But for me, all of this started with the Ed O'Bannon case. It was an early case that I covered when I first started writing about the business of college sports. I will not bore you with tons of legal details, but I want to go through just a couple of cases to show you how these dominoes started to fall, because I think what we saw happen this summer with name, image, and likeness legislation changing and student athletes now being allowed to profit off their name, image, and likeness started with the Ed O'Bannon case. Not to say that the conversation had never been had before that, but I think that that's when we started to see real change. And it has now taken us a decade to get where we are now, where we are allowing student athletes to profit off their name, image, and likeness. So at issue in the O'Bannon case was the EA Sports NCAA basketball game. There was a football game and a basketball game. Ed O'Bannon was a UCLA basketball player who believed that his image and likeness were being used in the EA Sports game and that student athletes should be compensated for that use. EA Sports, even if they had wanted to, couldn't have compensated student athletes because of NCAA rules. What Ed O'Bannon was looking for in that case wasn't money. He wanted the judge to issue an injunction saying that EA Sports could no longer produce the game if they weren't going to compensate the people whose name, image, and likeness they were using in the game. And he won that case. I'll tell you what ended up coming out of that case. EA Sports actually prior to that stopped producing the football and basketball games during the course of this case. I think it was filed in 2009, but the decision didn't happen until 2013 or 2014. So there was this long period of time between when everybody was sort of put on notice about this and when there was an actual ruling. So EA Sports voluntarily pulled those off the market. They have never come back. However, EA Sports has already announced they are bringing back the college football game, and I would imagine they will also bring back the basketball game, although they have not officially confirmed that yet. Ed O'Bannon wasn't trying to kill the video game. I've seen him talk in interviews about how people attack him on Twitter all the time about how he ruined the video games and it's his fault they went away. What ended up actually coming out of that case is that the judge in that case said that universities and athletic departments could not set a cap on the way they compensated student athletes to tuition, room, and board, that they needed to pay up to cost of attendance at the very least. I won't get into it. There were some weird things in her ruling. She talked about this $5,000 stipend and a trust, and there were all sorts of ideas going on at that time. But the practical outcome of that case is that schools were allowed to go to cost of attendance. And so instead of just paying tuition, room, and board, they could pay up to cost of attendance. And if you look back during that time, you'll see a lot of conversation around cost of attendance stipends. And there was a fear that because some schools, the cost of attendance stipend would be higher than other schools because the cost of living in some cities is higher than others. So maybe a student athlete at UCLA would get more than a student athlete at Florida because LA is a more expensive place to live than Gainesville is. In most cases, I've lived in both, and it was definitely more expensive to live in Southern California than it was here in Gainesville. And so there was a lot of conversation around whether that was going to impact recruiting, and students would want to go to schools with larger cost of attendance stipends. Almost 10 years later, we haven't seen that be the case. I've never seen anyone allege that that is the case and that that's what came out of that. But that's really what we got from that case was cost of attendance stipends. And then shortly thereafter, we had the Keller case, which was also about the EA Sports video games. But in that case, they were seeking monetary damages. They wanted the players who've been depicted in the games to be compensated for use of their image and likeness in the game. And they ended up settling with the NCAA, EA Sports, and CLC, which is Collegiate Licensing Company. They hold the licenses for a lot of the universities that were depicted in the game. That settlement was a total of $16 million, and it was distributed to student athletes who believed that they had appeared in games. And it was based on the number of times you had appeared and a number of other factors, but the payouts ended up being from a few $100s to, I think the highest paid player I remember seeing was around $5,000. Don't quote me on that. It's been a little while since I looked that up. But what we got out of that case was some former student athletes getting paid out for their appearance in those games. And he's not going to let me pull up more bullets. I think the clicker has died.
Is it really?
I think so. Thank you. We can at least get through a few more bullets. The other thing we saw, you'd stop there. I'm going to at least go through these. So the other thing that we have seen come out of the cases that happened during that time period is also unlimited meals and snacks. There used to be very strict rules around how you could feed student athletes, and it didn't always make a lot of sense because student athletes, obviously, they're in classes, they're in practice, they're at games, they're in study halls. They had all these things that didn't fit the schedule in a lot of cases, and some teams would get to eat, and other teams wouldn't get to eat, and it was sort of a mess. And you had student athletes who were getting violations for really silly things around being provided really basic, snacks to get them from one practice to the next. And so now universities and athletic departments are allowed to offer unlimited meals and snacks to student athletes. Also out of those cases, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you're welcome to ask questions about it later. Northwestern's football team attempted to unionize. They wanted to be declared employees and have the right to collectively bargain with the university and the athletic department for their compensation, for their practice times, for everything, the way that we see in pro athletics with collective bargaining. On the regional level, the student athletes actually won, and they ruled in favor of the student athletes. But when it went to the National Labor Relations Board, they sort of punted. They really didn't give a decision so much as they decided on procedural grounds to kick it out. Unionization is an interesting topic because at public universities, you might see different things than at private universities. In about half of the states, public employees cannot unionize. So if you were at a public university like this and you were deemed to be an employee as a student athlete, then if state law didn't allow public employees to unionize, you wouldn't be able to, even though maybe student athletes at University of Wisconsin could. And I'm not up to date on my state by state union law, so I'm not going to pretend that those examples are accurate. But you would see it being treated differently across the country, and there would also be very different rules between private universities and public. So we'll talk on a later slide about where I think we're headed as far as potential unionization and classification as employees go, but we've not gotten there at this point. None of the cases have declared student athletes to be employees, and so they are not paid like employees. The last case that happened was this summer. The last sort of important case to this discussion, in my opinion, was the Alston case. The Supreme Court decision came down this summer, 9-0, which is incredibly rare in Supreme Court decisions that everybody gets along and agrees, but on this they did. It did not speak directly to NIL. It was actually about what they consider education-related expenses. And so athletic departments are now allowed to offer money for study abroad, for postgraduate internships, for additional tutoring, for laptops, anything they can tie back to education. They now have the ability to offer to student athletes, and there's no limit on that. For our discussion here, the important thing about the Alston case is that it happened 2 weeks before state laws on name, image, and likeness were set to go into effect. And I think it did have a major impact on the way the NCAA decided to handle NIL, because back in January, they had released proposed rules that had guardrails. There were all these rules around how student athletes could do deals, who they could do them with, certain banned categories, the ways in which boosters could work with student athletes. It was a much longer document. And when we finally got the rule this summer in the 11th hour, literally the day before the state laws were set to go into effect on July 1st, there were essentially 3 parts of the rule. And they said that if you live in a state that has an active state law, you follow the state law. If you live in a state that does not have an active state law, then you follow your institutional policy. And then the third prong of it talked about how you can now hire agents, attorneys, financial advisors relative to just NIL marketing. And Brandon, we'll talk about it later, but this is still not a situation where you're hiring an agent to help you with your pro opportunities while you're still in school, but they can help you with your NIL marketing activities. So that was really it. That was all we got from the NCAA were those 3 prongs. They had a frequently asked questions document that gives you a little more insight into things, but they really backed off of the guardrails they were going to have. And it's had an interesting impact because a lot of schools, most schools, were counting on the NCAA to set the rules. And all of a sudden in the 11th hour, they found out they have to set their own rules. There are still schools right now, 2 months later, who don't have rules. I was just at University of Louisville a couple of weeks ago, and while I was there, they did not have active rules. They had a letter that had been sent out to boosters that talked about what they thought they were and were not going to allow, but there were actually no rules under which their student athletes were acting. Since I was there 2 weeks ago, they have now released their rules. It is the longest rule document I've seen so far. It is 14 pages. So there's this real variance from one school to the next. Some schools have simple 1-page guidelines. Louisville has 14, and then there's everything in between as well. And so now we have this, I keep calling it a patchwork of rules and laws, because some states have NIL laws that say that student athletes can profit off their name, image, and likeness. Some have passed laws, but they're not in effect yet. And then institutions have rules. Eventually, I imagine they will all have them, but some of them are still scrambling and working with their legal departments to put these rules together. And so it's been interesting in the early days as brands and student athletes have tried to navigate this when they don't exactly know what the rules are.
It's working again. Thank you.
So there are close to 20 states now that have laws that are either active or go active before the end of the year. I was just sitting here at my computer updating the list. So if that's something you're interested in, you want to check out, if you go on business@collegesports.com, there's a menu item that says trackers. And under trackers, there's a state law tracker where you can see all the links to the state laws, what date they're effective, which states are still pending and working on laws. There's also a tracker of institutional policies. If for some reason you want to look at Florida's or any other school that I've been able to hunt down and see what the rules are, you can. They vary greatly at some institutions. For example, at some institutions, if you're over 21, you can do a brand deal with an alcohol brand, but at some schools you can't, no matter what age you are. Almost all of them have bans on tobacco, on gambling companies. But then it varies by school beyond that. Some talk about CBD products and some don't. Some talk about prescription drugs and some don't. I finally saw, I don't know, maybe 20 schools had rules out in the first like 24 hours of this kind of happening on July 1st. And one school was the first I saw to put in there that you couldn't promote adult entertainment sites or venues. And then all of a sudden, all these other schools were like, oh, we forgot about that category and we're adding it in. And so a lot of these are evolving. Sometimes I go back to that institutional policy tracker that I have and I click on a link and it's broken because they've taken it back down because either they're revising their rules or they've moved it somewhere else and they are still tweaking it. And so student athletes and brands are out there creating deals with ever changing rules, literally sometimes changing on a daily basis. I'm gonna sort of skip over NIA, except to say that they passed their legislation before the NCAA did. They passed theirs last October. And I asked the president of NAIA, I had him on my podcast. I said, why do you think you were able to get this done faster than the NCAA was able to? And he had on his bookshelf behind him the NAIA rule book, which is like this thick, and then the NCAA, which is like multiple volumes. A greater number of student athletes at the NCAA level, but also there's always been a greater level of violations when it comes to improper payments to student athletes and booster involvement. And so the NAIA was able to get that passed a little more quickly. My clicker stopped working. It only likes me sometimes. And I would just say about federal laws, multiple federal laws were proposed last year. None of them were passed before the state laws went into effect. You know, a lot of folks have lobbied for those federal laws because they want there to be one national standard. It would certainly make life easier. I was joking with Brandon, my reporting would be so much less interesting right now if there was one national law. Part of what's been interesting as a reporter has been following all these differences. There had been a lot of momentum for a federal law leading up to July 1st. But I've talked to a lot of folks since then that were involved in that process, and the momentum has sort of died. Part of that is because they're not in session, but part of it is because now we're seeing it play out. We're a couple of months in, and there haven't been any real egregious violations. We haven't seen anyone at least getting caught doing anything, you know, that violates any of the rules. And so the momentum for that federal law, I think, has really slowed down at this point, and I'm not convinced there's going to be one. If there is one, it wouldn't be until next year. But at this point, I'm not positive that there's going to be one. So. A few, you can go ahead and do, I think there's 3 bullets on the slide. Thank you. A few issues that have popped up are with international student athletes. Due to their student visa rules, they are not allowed to participate in NIL. There are very strict rules about the amount of time they can work, and they're only allowed to work within the university. And so they haven't been able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. We had somebody in here earlier today that was saying that Florida is going to maybe shift part of their policy about making money when you're outside of the country. And so a lot of schools are trying to figure out how can they help their international student athletes take advantage of this, because as it stands right now, every athletic department I know of has told their international student athletes that they cannot do these deals right now because they risk their student visa. And that's obviously not something the school can control. So we need guidance from the federal government on how it's supposed to play out for international student athletes. And then high school athletes have been a really interesting aspect of this as well, because when the NCAA put out their frequently asked questions, they specifically said high school student athletes have at it. You can do NIL deals too. And then the woman who's the president of the National High School Association, and I'm going to screw up the name of the association, but she came out and said, wait a second, no, our state high school association rules say that you cannot monetize your name, image, and likeness, and we don't want to change that. And so it's been interesting to watch that play out, because in the state of California, it is allowed by law that high school and younger youth student athletes can monetize their name, image, and likeness. In Texas, Mississippi, and Illinois, in their state laws that were passed to allow college student athletes to monetize their NIL, it specifically says that high school student athletes cannot monetize their NIL. And so we saw something really interesting happen in Texas. Quinn Ewers, who is the #1 commit for next football season, decided to forego his final year of high school. He only had 1 required class left, and he decided to forego his senior year, hurry up and finish, and start at Ohio State this fall because he was being offered reportedly seven figures of over $1 million in NIL deals. He has already signed, I think, 2 NIL deals. I'm not sure that I believe that those are worth 7 figures. And Brandon will maybe talk about this later. He said something interesting when we were talking about it earlier today in terms of how deals are structured so that you can say things like it's a 6-figure deal, it's a 7-figure deal. But he did choose to leave high school early and enroll at Ohio State so that he could take advantage of NIL deals because Texas state law doesn't allow him to. We saw Mikey Williams, one of the top basketball recruits, go to an elite academy to complete his basketball career because they're not subject to the state high school association rules. So I've been kind of interested to see how many elite student athletes will we see moving to private institutions or to these elite academies where they're not under the state high school association rules and can monetize their name, image, and likeness. So I think we're still learning how that's going to play out. And some state high school associations are considering removing the restriction. I think it's New York is going to vote on it in October. So I do think it's possible that we'll see some states decide to start lifting those laws, but that is still, or not laws, but rules. But that's still sort of an evolving area of this. And then you've got Title IX considerations. And as somebody with a law degree, I always found Title IX really interesting. And it's not so much that women aren't going to have opportunities. It's about the equal treatment from the athletic department. So for example, Notre Dame put up a bunch of billboards for their football recruits. This was actually prior to July 1st. It was earlier in the summer. And on those billboards, they had the student athlete's photo and their name, and they had their social media handles on there. And it was, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 incoming student athletes. And I asked the question to some Title IX experts I know, is that kosher? Can the athletic department be marketing these individual male student athletes and plugging their social media channels and not doing the same for some female student athletes? Because now that there's money on the line with NIL, even though that money doesn't come from the athletic department, you're giving more marketing and promotion to these male student athletes. UCF did it during their spring football game. Notre Dame's not the only one. There've been a number of instances of this. And so that's something I'm kind of keeping my eye on. And then I also had a compliance officer bring up a really interesting point with me. If you've been following NIL at all, you might have heard of companies, Open Doors and Influencer. They provided services even prior to NIL to athletic departments, where athletic departments can upload photos and videos that their official photographers have taken at games for student athletes to use on their social media or their websites. They can't earn money from those photos because they utilize school intellectual property, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they can use it if they just need content on their timeline. And they've been doing that even before NIL. Well, now the question is coming up, what if you have every football student athlete has 300 photos of himself in there, but the female volleyball players have 6 each? Is that a Title IX violation? And I had quite frankly never thought of that before until a compliance person brought it up. But several schools told me that they're now being very careful about the assets they're offering to their student athletes and making sure that that's equal across both their male and their female student athletes. Okay, so what we've kind of seen happen that's been neat is this new economy forming around NIL. So we've seen new compliance platforms come out. There was software previously that athletic departments used for compliance, but we've seen a lot more that are very focused on NIL and on student athletes reporting these deals as they get them. Some of those compliance platforms, most of them, also offer education. So they've got short videos and document resources within those platforms, so that if a student athlete wants to do one-on-one coaching or they want to hold a clinic, there's information in there about, legal and insurance needs to be able to carry out those things. So we've seen a lot of those platforms either expand from what they were already doing with athletic departments, or new software and platforms come into the space. And then we've seen a lot of content platforms and marketplaces come into the space. And I literally get pitched a new one, I think, every single day as a reporter. A new platform that has popped up that's going to match student athletes with brands, or that's going to allow student athletes to sell their own t-shirts, or it's going to allow them to sell game worn gear and memorabilia or their autographs. And so you're seeing a lot of people come into this space from the outside to try to help student athletes monetize their name, image, and likeness. And these companies want to get their foothold in this space as well, because there's a little bit of a big money grab going on in this space right now. A lot of really great companies with innovative technology and ideas. And quite frankly, I've been pitched a lot of companies that have no idea what they're doing in this space. So I've got a tracker on my site as well that tracks all the marketplaces. And I've really only put marketplaces on there that I've had a chance to look at and somewhat vet, although I have a disclaimer still on that page. But I've been pitched a lot of companies I haven't put there because I don't think that they are doing things correctly and they don't have student athletes' best interests at heart, and I don't want to see student athletes losing their eligibility over these things. So there are a number of marketplaces out there, and if you're a student athlete or you know somebody who is, I would just encourage them, to try and talk to other people who've used the platform and get a feel for how it worked out for them, to really understand how that platform works, how the revenue share works, how much of your money are they going to take? Are they taking it from you? Are they taking it from the brand that's working with you? And I think maybe on the next slide, I've got a little, I have to talk about those things. Okay, so this is part of the tracker that's on my website. It's much longer than this, but I put just a snippet of it so that you can see. So it's got the platform and then tells you what that particular platform does. And then I also went in and have tried to figure out, and I've gotten most of them, and figured out what the fees or the revenue share are. So for some, they're totally passing the fees to the brand or to the customer who's purchasing something from you. And in some cases, they're taking as much as 30% from you. So I've told student athletes to really pay attention to that, because there's a lot of platforms you could be on, and why be on one that's going to take 30% of your money if you don't have to be? Now, that's not to say that there's never a reason to be on platforms that do, but just to be aware that there are those big differences between marketplaces. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to run kind of quickly through how we've seen student athletes making money so far. So social media marketing was definitely the first thing that we saw, because that was the low-hanging fruit. A lot of student athletes already had huge platforms and huge followings on social media. So there were a lot of brands that were lining up deals even prior to July 1st with student athletes. That student athletes were then signing on July 1st so that it met with rules where they would be promoting the brand on their social media. And I've seen a lot of student athletes taking advantage of that who don't have huge followings. There's a softball student athlete that I've worked with, and I think she has 1,300 followers on Instagram, but she's actually worked with 3 different brands already. They're local brands who are very supportive of her school, and in particular of her softball program, who already knew her and wanted to reach more of her audience. And so she has been able to monetize, even though she doesn't necessarily have the largest following. And then we've seen people on the other end of the spectrum. Like I reported a deal last week on Libby Dunn, who's a gymnast at LSU. She is the most followed college athlete in America. She has a huge following on TikTok and on Instagram, and she just did a mid-6 figures deal with an athletic wear brand last week. She's going to be doing social media promo and I think personal appearances for them for the next 2 years. And so it'll be interesting to see a longer term, bigger deal like that play out. We've also seen student athletes putting together their own camps and clinics. A lot of those were already happening over the summer as soon as this went into effect. A lot of student athletes doing one-on-one coaching, sometimes in person. Some of those platforms that I talked about also offer virtual lessons where student athletes have been able to monetize virtually in giving lessons to younger athletes. We've seen them making personal appearances already at restaurants and car dealerships and that sort of thing. They're selling their autographs and memorabilia. They are starting to get involved in group licensing deals. So UF signed a deal already with Brandar, which is a company that is going in and signing with athletic departments to get the licensing rights to the athletic department's logos and intellectual property. And then they can turn around and do group deals with student athletes. So if the whole baseball team wants to do something together, Brandar can help them pull that together and has the right to the university's intellectual property. In order to do that, mostly what I've seen talked about in that space is trading cards. And I think that's some of the first group licensing sort of opportunities that you'll see come out of groups like Brandar, but there are opportunities for greater group licensing as well. We've seen student athletes creating their own merchandise. Sometimes they're creating it totally on their own, selling it on their own platform. Sometimes they're partnering with existing platforms and existing clothing wear brands to create things in partnership with them. We've seen a lot of affiliate or ambassador roles where they're going to get paid based on people clicking on their link or using their promo code. I just reported on one of those yesterday. A jeans company did a deal. They offered it to the entire Ole Miss football team. And these jeans are custom fit. They are $450 jeans. I don't know about you guys, but I don't own $450 jeans. And they get a free pair of jeans in exchange for social media promotion, but then they also get a unique code. And anytime their code is used to order jeans, they get $100 per pair of jeans sold, and there's no ceiling on it. So if you had somebody who had a real passion for fashion and had a great following, they could maybe make some decent money off of that. In fact, I tweeted about it yesterday because I wrote the story, and one of the quotes in the story from the brand was about how even I think it was the third string kicker, got the opportunity for this deal. And I had two different people tweet at me today that asked, who is the third string kicker and what is his promo code? Because I want to order the jeans and use his code because I think it'd be really cool to make sure he gets paid. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, they say that on Twitter. Are they actually ordering $450 jeans? I don't know. But it was sort of interesting to see fans' reaction to that. And it was overall really positive, at least in my Twitter feed. And Twitter is so rarely positive that, that it was nice to see. So we've seen a lot of those affiliate and ambassador kind of situations. And then we're starting to see more and more with NFTs. In fact, I have a story, I think, coming in the next week or two, actually with a former college basketball player who's going to do a really cool NFT. But we've seen a few of those so far. We've seen student athletes who already have existing blogs or podcasts who are monetizing those. There have also been a lot of student athletes, especially in football because we're in season, who are getting paid to go on radio shows or podcasts as a guest. I did a story a couple of weeks ago that was about a podcast called The J Boy Show. It's a mainly SEC football podcast. And they were paying, I think it's 7 different SEC football players to come on weekly and discuss the game from the week before and the upcoming game. And I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head, I think they're getting $250 per episode to do that. And I think that's interesting because radio stations have long paid pro players to come do this. In fact, my husband worked in sports talk radio, and I knew they had done a deal with Tim Tebow years ago. And I was like, do you remember how much you guys were paying him per week? Like, I was just curious how it was different from what we're seeing student athletes get. Unfortunately, he couldn't remember how much it was, but he thought from a radio perspective, $250 a week was fair and was a good deal for a radio station or for a podcast to get those guys on to talk about the game, because historically, athletic departments have not really wanted their student athletes to go on the radio and talk about the game. And you had to go through the SID and you had to get permission to talk to them. And most of the time you were told no. And now student athletes really sort of have that agency to make that decision for themselves. And we're seeing them go on radio shows and podcasts and give this sort of inside look at their game that we weren't getting before. So I found those kind of media deals to be interesting. And then I've had a lot of student athletes ask me about getting paid for public speaking. And I think that's really cool because when I was your age, I don't think I ever would have imagined I would have been interested in getting up in a room full of people and talking. And now it's part of my career and I love it. And I do it all the time in front of enormous audiences. And I think it's so much fun. But at your age, I'm pretty sure I would have been terrified and had no interest. But a lot of student athletes have shown interest in that. And then we've seen student athletes who are monetizing their music, their art. They are becoming entrepreneurs. A lot of the marketplaces that we've seen are founded by either former student athletes or current student athletes. Dreamfield is one of the ones I've seen that really is doing a decent number of deals for student athletes. And the co-founders for that are the quarterback from FSU and the quarterback from Miami, which I also think is cool because who would think those guys would even be friends? And now they have created this company together where they're helping other student athletes get more NIL deals. And that's been a surprising part of NIL that I personally enjoyed, is seeing how student athletes are helping each other. There've been a lot of quarterbacks and people who already have great exposure and great followings who, when they get offered a deal, instead of just taking it for themselves, are saying, how could we restructure this deal so I could include my whole offensive line? Or what could we do that's a whole team deal? And so we've seen a lot of group deals happening, especially during football season for football teams. And I've seen a few already for both men's and women's basketball teams. And they're these group deals or full team deals. And I think that's really cool. It's not something I expected to happen with NIL, but has been really neat to see play out. And then as far as potential issues popping up, there's a lot when it comes to the social media marketing space in terms of figuring out what the contract should look like. How much should you be getting paid? If you're getting paid for an Instagram post, how long should that post stay up? It's actually really common in the influencer space that the post only has to stay up for a month or 6 months or a year, and that influencers will go back and take that out of their feed later. So understanding how long you need to leave it up, understanding how the brand can use that content that you're creating for them. I just saw this in a group I was in the other day with a bunch of influencers where she was originally paid to create one Instagram post, and now they had come back and they wanted to use that image to run an ad, and they wanted to put it on the cover of some printed marketing materials. And she had come into the group to say, don't you think I should ask them to pay me more because they only paid me for a post. Now they're going to get more value out of it by using it these other ways. They're asking me for permission. Is it okay for me to negotiate back with them and say, if you want to use it in these other ways, it's going to be this additional fee. So that's something that I think most student athletes probably don't have a whole lot of experience with because they haven't been allowed to do this before now. And so really understanding that it can be super exciting to get offered $100 or $500 or $1,000 to do one Instagram post or one TikTok video, but do you really understand the agreement you have with the company in terms of how it's being used, how long it's being used, how many edits they can ask for if you're doing an Instagram post in your feed, and they make these tiny little edits and you're having to reshoot the photo over and over and over again. I know an influencer that this happened to. She got offered $100 for an Instagram post. She thought that was great money for her following, and it was. But there were no limit in her contract to the number of edits the brand could ask for, and she ended up reshooting the photo 11 times. And so then the $100 didn't sound so good anymore because it took way more of her time than she anticipated. So there are things like that I think that student athletes need to be more aware of so that they can work out those terms in advance. And then there's been some really interesting discussion too around state taxes, which I know doesn't sound interesting or exciting, but it's interesting in this aspect. Okay, if you live in Louisiana and you're a resident of Louisiana, but you go to school in South Carolina and you go shoot a commercial in LA, you could actually end up having to pay taxes in all 3 states on what you get paid for that promotional activity. New York City has its own, and so I was talking to actually she's local here, Katie Davis, is with a CPA with a firm here who works a lot with athletic departments, and we were talking about different examples. And she said, did you see those student athletes who were in Times Square on July 1st? And I think the Cavender twins were there, Libby Dunn was there. I can't remember who else, but you saw several student athletes who'd been taken by brands up there. They had big billboards in Times Square. They were shooting Instagram and TikTok content down in Times Square. And Katie said, did you know New York City has its own city tax if you do business there, and that they're not only going to get taxed on the value of the trip, so they're going to get taxed for that free flight they had there and the free hotel room they had and all the meals that were covered while they were there. They're going to get taxed on the value of that, even though they didn't receive cash. And not only are they going to be taxed in their home state, they're going to be taxed in New York City because they were in Times Square doing it. And did they know that? I don't know. I have no idea if they did that or not. Maybe they did. Those are all student athletes who are at a level where they do have agents and advisors. I'm sure Brandon will talk about this more later, but there's also a lot of student athletes out there who aren't getting deals big enough to warrant having an agent. I think I've heard Brandon talk several times today about, from an agent's perspective, which student athletes you would want to work with and how difficult it can be to pull together these brand deals. And so you're gonna have a lot of student athletes who aren't gonna have that kind of advisor who's telling them, hey, just remember, if you take this free trip, you're gonna be taxed on the value of this trip. So some really interesting issues around state taxes. And then I won't belabor this point of choice of law, but when you sign a deal with a brand, if they have a written contract, and hopefully they do, there will be a choice of law provision that basically says if we disagree, this is going to be litigated in front of a court in Los Angeles. Well, if I live here in Florida and now I've got to get an attorney out there and fly out there if we ever have a dispute, A couple of professors I've talked to have brought up some interesting issues around that choice of law provision that student athletes should be looking out for. And then you've got varying state agent requirements. Some states have a very detailed process for becoming a registered agent in the state. Some states have nothing at all. And so on a state by state basis, it really differs. And I've heard agents asking questions around, okay, if I'm an agent in Kansas, and this was actually a real example I heard a few weeks ago. If I'm an agent in Kansas, but I want to work with a student athlete who's in Louisiana, and I think they were doing a deal that was maybe in California. We had all these different states involved, and he was like, which state do I need to be registered in? And I was like, not my area of law. I don't know, ask somebody else. So there's a lot of questions coming even from brands and from agents who are getting involved in this space, trying to figure out how all the different rules apply. And then in terms of the effect we've sort of seen NIL have so far, it's been interesting in athletic departments because most people I know who work in athletics are already overworked and have too much on their plate. Both my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law have worked in college athletics the whole time I've known them. And compliance folks in these departments now got a lot dumped in their laps all at once. They thought there was going to be a national third party. They kept calling it a third party administrator. The NCAA was going to choose this third party that was going to oversee compliance, and they were going to be the ones that student athletes were going to submit their forms through, that were going to, vet all this stuff out. And then in the 11th hour, the NCAA notified all the third party administrators that they weren't going to do one after all. And so it all fell back to schools. And when you start talking about like FCS level athletic departments, Division II, Division III, a lot of those athletic departments have one person who works in compliance, who now has to handle all the other compliance issues they already had, in addition to now educating their student athletes about NIL, going through all these forms their student athletes are filling in as they do their brand deals. So I'm seeing athletic departments start to staff up a little bit. Some, especially at the Power 5 level like this, we've seen athletic departments hiring people whose job title says something about NIL. And I think that we're going to continue to see that. And then, go ahead and go to the next slide, because I'll skip some of this that is less interesting. This is a list I put together after speaking at University of Louisville, because students who weren't athletes were asking me, if I'm really interested in this, how can I get involved? How can this be part of my career plan moving forward? And I think there's a ton of opportunity around this. And I've actually seen a lot of undergrad and grad students already getting involved. So there's those new jobs being created in athletic departments. Law schools and accounting programs are putting together clinics where their students are helping student athletes navigate some of this. There's obviously opportunities as agents and financial advisors and other sorts of representation. I've seen students who are becoming essentially personal assistants for a student athlete that they're friends with, who doesn't have time to go through all the stuff, all the DMs they're getting and all the stuff they're getting in their inbox relative to NIL. I've had a couple of students contact me who are acting as video editors or podcast editors for student athletes who are creating content and don't have time to do that piece of the content creation. Graphic designers, website designers who are working with student athletes already, social media managers. We've seen students who are partnering with student athletes to co-found some of these platforms. So I think there's actually a lot of opportunity, even if you're not an athlete, if this is interesting to you, to get involved in it at some level, depending on what your skill level is and what your interest level is. But I think this is only going to grow, and that athletic departments are going to have whole teams of people dedicated to NIL. And so if this is something that interests you, I would encourage you to go over to the athletic department and ask them, how can you start getting involved? Because I think that every athletic department out there right now is trying to figure out how to do enough for their student athletes around this, and none of them are staffed well enough to be able to cover everything they want to do. So if this interests you, I just encourage you to look for a way to get involved, because there's definitely opportunities out there.